I never imagined how suffocating freedom could feel until they took it away. Belview Prison, a crumbling fortress of despair nestled in the mountains, was now my home. The echoes of iron gates slamming shut, the distant hum of broken dreams, and the ceaseless gaze of unseen eyes became my reality. Every second inside those walls gnawed at my sanity, teasing it apart thread by thread. The first thing they told me when I arrived was simple: stay away from Block E. Of course, they didn't explain why. Nobody ever did. It was an unspoken rule that seemed to hang in the air like a thick fog, suffocating any curiosity. Even the guards, with their iron stares and cigarette-stained grins, walked faster when they passed that section of the prison. My cellmate Dawson had been here for years. His eyes were hollow, skin taut against his skull like he had long given up. "You hear it at night, don't you?" he asked one evening, his voice low and cracked from years of silence. "Hear what?" He looked at me like I was a dead man walking. "The whispers from Block E. They start around midnight. Always do." Dawson didn't elaborate. He just crawled into his bunk, pulling the thin sheet over his head like a scared child. That night I waited. As the hours ticked by, the prison grew quiet, save for the distant clanking of keys or the occasional shout from a guard. I told myself I wouldn't hear anything. But then, just as my eyelids began to droop, there it was, a faint, rasping whisper that slithered through the walls. I froze, every hair on my body standing on end. It was soft at first, like a distant wind passing through hollow bones. But as I lay there, the sound grew clearer. Voices, multiple, desperate and pleading like a chorus of the damned. They weren't speaking English, though. The words were foreign, twisted, their meanings obscured by years of decay and madness. Yet somehow I understood them. They were calling for help, begging for release. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing the voices away, but they persisted, louder and more insistent. I bit down on my knuckles to stop myself from screaming. What the hell was this place? The following morning, I asked around, cautiously bringing up Block E. Most prisoners avoided my gaze, pretending they hadn't heard me. But there was one guy, an older inmate named Gerald, who sat in the corner of the yard, hunched and muttering to himself. He had been in Belview for nearly 30 years. "They built over it," Gerald whispered, his breath sour and his eyes wide with a mix of fear and excitement. "Block E wasn't supposed to be a cell block. It was something else before, something older. The warden won't tell you, but the land, this land, it's cursed." "Cursed?" I scoffed, but my voice wavered. The previous night's whispers still echoed in my mind. "Yeah," he nodded furiously. "People go missing. Guards, prisoners, doesn't matter. They vanish and the prison just covers it up. Says they were transferred, paroled. But they're gone." Gerald leaned in closer, his voice a barely audible hiss. "And at night, the ones they took, they call for you. They want you to join them." I backed away, the sickening chill of his words settling into my bones. This was insanity. I had to be hallucinating, maybe the food or the water. But when I returned to my cell, Dawson was waiting for me, his eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. "They almost got you last night," he said, staring at the floor. "I saw you twitching in your bed, like they were pulling at your soul." I stared at him wide-eyed. How could he have known? "What are you talking about?" "They come for you in your dreams first," Dawson explained, his voice eerily calm. "That's how they get you. Lure you in when you're too weak to fight back. After a few nights, you're gone. Like the others. Don't let them in again, or you're next." I didn't sleep that night. Couldn't. Every sound, every whisper felt like a hand reaching out from the shadows, trying to drag me into the depths of Block E. The next morning, I asked the guard if I could be transferred to another cell block. He just laughed. "No one moves from Block D," he said. "Especially not closer to Block E." There was no escape. 2 weeks passed and the whispers grew stronger. I had become a hollow version of myself, constantly on edge, sleep-deprived, and terrified of closing my eyes. Dawson wasn't faring any better. His skin had taken on a grayish hue, his eyes sunken deep into his skull like they were retreating from the horrors he had seen. "Tonight's different," he muttered one evening, pacing the cell. His voice was shaky, desperate. "It's the anniversary." "Anniversary?" I asked, but deep down I didn't want to know. The night block E was sealed. I could feel my heartbeat quicken. I didn't want to ask more, but the words tumbled out of my mouth. Why was it sealed? Dawson stopped pacing and turned to me, his face a mask of fear and hopelessness. Because of what they found. He didn't say anything more, just sat down on his bunk, staring at the ceiling as if waiting for something terrible. That night, the whispers started earlier, much earlier. By 10, I could hear them, louder than ever before. They were clearer now, the voices sharp and distinct, each one filled with rage, sorrow, and madness. And they weren't just calling from the distance. They felt closer, like they were just outside the cell door, waiting. I sat up in bed, cold sweat dripping down my neck. Dawson was wide awake too, his body rigid. "Don't listen to them," he whispered. But it was too late. The whispers had already wormed their way into my mind, wrapping around my thoughts, pulling me into their dark, suffocating world. I could see images, flashes of long corridors, damp and decaying, lit by flickering bulbs. And at the end of the corridor, there was a door. The door was old, its surface covered in strange symbols that glowed faintly in the darkness. It was locked, chained from top to bottom, but I could hear something on the other side. It was scratching, pounding, desperate to get out. I gasped, snapping back to reality, my chest heaving as if I had been running for miles. Dawson was standing now, his back pressed against the cell wall, his eyes locked on the door. "Do you see it too?" I asked, my voice trembling. He nodded slowly, his face pale as death. The door, that door, wasn't just in my mind anymore. It was there on the far wall of our cell, flickering in and out of existence like a mirage. The symbols on it pulsed with a sickly green light, and the chains rattled, as if whatever was behind it was getting restless. "We need to get out," Dawson whispered. But the cell was locked, and there was nowhere to go. We both watched, frozen in terror, as the door shimmered one last time before solidifying. The chains that held it shut began to loosen, and a low, guttural growl emanated from behind it. Something was coming. I don't know how long we stood there, watching that door shimmer into reality. Time seemed to stretch, distorted by the panic flooding my veins. The chains were rattling louder now, as if whatever was behind that door was desperate to escape. Dawson was muttering to himself, his hands trembling as he wrung them together. They're coming for us. We need to move," I said, my voice cracking, but there was no way out. We were trapped, stuck in this nightmare with nothing but the cold cement walls and that cursed door between us and whatever was clawing its way toward freedom. The rattling stopped. For a moment, there was silence so thick it pressed against my skull, filling my ears with a high-pitched ringing. I wanted to scream, to wake up from whatever hellish dream this was. But this wasn't a dream. Suddenly, the door creaked open just a crack, a thin sliver of light spilling through, green, sickly, and pulsing like the heartbeat of a dying creature. The chains fell away with a loud clatter, echoing off the walls of our tiny cell. Dawson let out a choked sob, backing himself into the corner. "Nu, nu, nu, nu," he whispered, his eyes wild with terror. The door swung wider, revealing the corridor I had seen in my visions. The same damp, decaying passageway lit by flickering, dying bulbs. The smell hit me next, a thick, nauseating stench of rot and mold, like something had been festering in the dark for far too long. "Do you hear it?" Dawson's voice was barely audible, a whisper carried on the stale air. "Hear what?" I asked, even though I already knew. The voices, those terrible, distorted whispers, had grown louder, but they weren't coming from the corridor. They were still inside my head, clawing at my thoughts, filling me with dread and despair. "They want us to follow," Dawson murmured. His eyes were fixed on the corridor, wide and glassy like he was in a trance. Before I could stop him, he stood up and began walking toward the door, "Dawson, wait!" I grabbed his arm, but he pulled away from me, shaking his head. "We can't hide from them. We're already marked," he said, his voice hollow. "If we stay, they'll take us like they took the others." I watched, helpless, as Dawson stepped through the door and into the corridor. The light swallowed him whole, leaving only his shadow on the floor of our cell. And then, as if by some unseen force, I felt my body moving, my legs carrying me forward, toward the door. I didn't want to follow, but something was pulling me, dragging me toward the darkness. The moment I crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind me with a deafening bang, and I was plunged into the decaying hallway. The air was damp, heavy with the scent of mildew and something far worse, something rancid like decomposing flesh. The walls were slick with moisture, and the floor squished underfoot, as though I were walking on wet earth. "Dawson!" My voice echoed down the corridor, but there was no response. The light overhead flickered, casting long, twisted shadows that writhed and shifted like they were alive. I moved forward, my heart pounding in my chest. The corridor stretched on endlessly, curving in ways that shouldn't have been possible. It felt like I was walking in circles, but the walls were different each time I looked. They twisted and bulged unnaturally, as if something was pressing against them from the other side, trying to break through. Then I heard it, a faint sound, like someone sobbing. It was coming from further down the corridor, echoing off the walls, growing louder with each step I took. "Dawson!" I called again, my voice trembling. But deep down, I knew it wasn't him. The sobbing grew louder, more desperate, filling the air with an overwhelming sense of grief and terror. It was like walking into someone's nightmare, but I couldn't wake up. I turned a corner and froze. There, at the end of the corridor, stood a figure. It was Dawson, or at least what was left of him. His back was to me, his shoulders hunched, his body trembling as he sobbed uncontrollably. His clothes were soaked with dark stains that glistened in the sickly light. "Dawson?" I whispered, taking a cautious step forward. He didn't turn around. He didn't acknowledge me at all. Instead, he just kept sobbing, his body shaking violently with each breath. The air around him seemed to ripple, distorting his form, making it difficult to tell where he ended and the shadows began. Something was very, very wrong. I stepped closer, but the moment I reached out to touch him, Dawson's body jerked violently. He turned his head slightly, just enough for me to see the side of his face. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, and filled with an unnatural terror. His mouth twisted into a grotesque grin. Blood trickled from his nose and mouth, staining his skin. They won't let me leave," he whispered through gritted teeth. And then, before I could react, Dawson's body was yanked backward, disappearing into the shadows with a sickening snap. I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest, while rising in my throat. The corridor around me seemed to shift, the walls closing in, warping and bending in impossible ways. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, filling my head with thoughts that weren't mine. They were inside me now, pulling at my consciousness, tugging me deeper into their madness. I turned to run, but the corridor stretched out endlessly in every direction, the walls narrowing, the shadows deepening. I could hear footsteps behind me, fast, heavy footsteps, like someone or something was chasing me, but I didn't dare look back. Then, just as I thought I would collapse, the corridor opened into a vast, cavernous space, a room that shouldn't exist beneath Belview Prison. It was dark, save for the faint glow of the green light pulsing from the walls, casting eerie shadows that flickered like candle flames. The ceiling was high, so high I couldn't see where it ended, and in the center of the room stood an altar, ancient, crumbling, covered in strange, twisted symbols that glowed faintly in the dark. On the altar lay someone. It was Dawson. His body was contorted, twisted in unnatural ways, his eyes wide open, staring blankly at the ceiling. His mouth was frozen in that same grotesque grin, blood pooling around his head. But the worst part? His body was moving, shaking violently, like he was still alive, still struggling. The whispers in my head grew louder, more frantic, as if they were trying to push me toward the altar. But I couldn't move. My legs felt like lead, my body frozen in place by some invisible force. And then, from the shadows behind the altar, something stirred. I couldn't see it clearly, but I felt its presence. A towering figure, shrouded in darkness, its eyes glowing with a malevolent light. It moved slowly, deliberately, its gaze fixed on me as it stepped forward, revealing a twisted, deformed face. Its mouth split into a wide, unnatural grin. The thing reached out a hand, long and skeletal, its fingers dripping with something thick and black. The whispers in my head turned into screams, piercing and deafening. As the thing moved closer, its grin widening with each step, I wanted to run. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. The darkness was closing in, suffocating me, pulling me deeper into its cold, unyielding grasp. I stood paralyzed, staring at the creature as it emerged from the shadows. Its body was wrong, twisted, elongated, moving with an unnatural fluidity that made my stomach churn. It wasn't human, but it wore the semblance of one, as though it had stolen someone's skin and draped it loosely over its bones. The way it moved toward me, slow but deliberate, felt like a nightmare crawling into the waking world. The thing's smile never faltered, stretched impossibly wide across its decaying face. Its eyes, glowing with a sickly light, never blinked. The whispers in my head morphed into shrieks, each one like a nail being driven into my skull, urging me to do something, anything, run, scream, fight. Yet I was frozen in place, unable to do more than stare. It was close now, close enough that I could smell its breath, a rancid stench of rot and decay that filled the cavernous room like a fog. The walls seemed to pulse in time with its movements, the ancient symbols glowing brighter, as if feeding off its presence. Then, without warning, the thing stopped, just inches from me. Its twisted hand reached out, hovering in the space between us. I wanted to recoil, to back away from its cold, skeletal fingers, but my body refused to obey. All I could do was watch, horrified, as its hand came closer, closer, until its fingers brushed against my skin. A cold, sharp pain shot through me like electricity. I gasped, my body convulsing as the thing's fingers curled around my arm, its grip impossibly strong. The moment it touched me, I felt a surge of images, flashes of dark, terrible things that weren't mine, horrors beyond imagining, scenes of torture, of death, of souls being torn apart in unspeakable ways. My mind was drowning in a flood of memories that didn't belong to me. I saw prisoners like Dawson being dragged through this very corridor, screaming, pleading for mercy as they were thrown onto the altar. I saw their bodies convulsing, their souls ripped from them, feeding the darkness beneath Belview. And I saw the thing standing before me now, once human, twisted by whatever ancient evil lay buried in this cursed place. In that moment, I understood. Belview wasn't just a prison. It was a feeding ground, a place where souls were harvested, consumed by the ancient forces that lurked beneath its foundations. Block E wasn't sealed because of dangerous prisoners. It was sealed to keep whatever lived down here hidden from the world above. The thing leaned closer, its breath cold against my face. "Join us?" It whispered, its voice like the grinding of stone. I felt the pull then, like invisible hands wrapping around my soul, tugging, tearing at the edges of my consciousness. It wanted to take me, to make me part of whatever dark ritual had been going on in this place for centuries. The pain was unbearable, like my skin was being peeled away, layer by layer, revealing the raw nerves underneath. But just as I felt myself slipping away, something broke through the haze of terror. A voice, faint at first but growing stronger. "Fight it! You have to fight it!" It was Dawson's voice, but not the broken, terrified version of him I had last seen. It was stronger now, more determined. I realized then that it wasn't just his body that had been taken. It was his will. And in that moment, I knew I couldn't let the same happen to me. With every ounce of strength I had left, I wrenched my arm free from the thing's grasp, stumbling backward. The creature's smile faltered for the briefest moment, as if surprised that I had resisted. The pulsing light in the room flickered, the walls trembling as if in protest. I turned and ran, my legs barely able to carry me, the pain in my chest making every breath a struggle. Behind me, I heard the creature's distorted voice, now filled with rage. "You cannot escape. We will find you." I didn't look back. Couldn't. The corridor ahead was a blur, twisting and shifting as the walls seemed to close in around me. I could hear the footsteps, heavy, echoing, getting closer with every step. But I didn't stop. Couldn't stop. My entire body screamed in agony, but adrenaline and sheer terror pushed me forward. The door. It had to be here somewhere. The door that had brought me into this nightmare. If I could find it, maybe, just maybe, I could get out. Suddenly, the ground beneath me gave way. I stumbled, falling hard onto the damp floor, my hands scraping against the rough stone. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and I could feel the presence behind me. Closer now, almost upon me. But then I saw it, a faint outline in the distance. The door. It was still there, shimmering faintly in the sickly green light. I scrambled to my feet, ignoring the searing pain in my legs, and ran toward it. The whispers were louder now, almost deafening, but I forced them out of my mind, focusing on that one sliver of hope. Just as I reached the door, I felt something cold and sharp graze the back of my neck. I screamed, throwing myself through the doorway, tumbling into the cell on the other side. The moment I crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind me with a loud, echoing bang. The whispers stopped. The air grew still. I lay there for what felt like hours, gasping for breath, my body trembling uncontrollably. Slowly, I forced myself to sit up, my mind still reeling from the horrors I had just escaped. The cell was quiet now. Dawson's bed was empty. I was alone. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, the silence was comforting. But I knew better than to believe it would last. The following days passed in a blur. I barely slept, barely ate, and when I did, it was in short, paranoid bursts, always with one eye on the door. The guards never mentioned Dawson again, and when I asked, they simply shrugged and told me he had been transferred. No one questioned it. No one cared. But I knew the truth. He wasn't transferred. He was taken. I didn't tell anyone what I had seen. They wouldn't believe me anyway. I kept to myself, counting the days, praying for the moment I'd leave this place. But deep down, I knew there was no leaving Belview. Not really. And then one night, as I lay on my bunk, staring at the ceiling, I heard it again. The whispers, faint at first, but growing louder with each passing second. My heart raced, my body frozen in place as the sound filled the cell, wrapping around me like a cold, suffocating blanket. I sat up, my eyes darting toward the far wall. The door was back. It shimmered in the darkness, the chains rattling faintly as if waiting for me to make a choice. This time I didn't move. I didn't acknowledge it. I just sat there, staring at the flickering light overhead, praying that it would leave me alone. But the whispers continued, growing louder, more insistent. And as I closed my eyes, trying to block them out, I realized something that made my blood run cold. The door wasn't just for me. It was waiting for someone else.